Jovan Scott Lewis is a professor in geography and African American studies, and we've invited him to talk about kind of the larger context and what are some of the issues that students are looking at in regard to these issues, and then also kind of the broader framing of issues around economic inequality and economic pressures in our community and society. And then Kyoko Thomas is Berkeley's new first ever basic needs manager, and she's going to talk about basic needs security on campus with some data that we have. It's very sobering, so stay tuned for that. And Christina Hill, professor in landscape architecture and environmental planning, has some examples from the College of Environmental Design of how these issues sort of come up in the classroom and in students' lives as they navigate through their coursework. And we will close out with Rachel Sandberg from the University Library talking about some really innovative ways of making course content more affordable and open access. So that's the arc of the panel, and then whatever all you want to talk about, we'll talk about together. So without further ado, Jovan.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So, microphone, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you, Amy, Jean, Victoria, for bringing me here this morning to speak with you all on what's a very important but unfortunately very immediately pressing topic, which are the various circuits of economic pressures that the Bay Area and its residents find themselves in, but most particularly our students here on campus. We know that as far as students, we know that these are matters that impact both undergraduates as well as graduate students who in many ways form a kind of labor backbone for our university. And so while I think we might be focusing a large part of our conversation today on the undergraduate experience, I just want us to take a moment to make sure that we keep graduate students and their experience at least in our minds. So we don't need to speak much about the broader circumstances of the housing crisis in the Bay Area. We understand that it's a very complicated circumstance which has a lot to do with limitations on housing construction, right? Rapidly growing population in the Bay Area specifically. California itself is a state that is, respectively compared to other states in the country, overpopulated in many ways. However, if we think about the ways in which that radiates inwards into the community of UC Berkeley, then we begin to have what is a concentrated experience of those broader disparities. And we have those experiences faced by a community who, as undergraduates, largely don't have the broader support systems or networks, i.e. many of our students are not from the state, many of our students are not from the area, but even for those who are from the state or who are from the area, in many ways their own families or their own kin networks are so stressed, are so stretched in fact, that they are unable to provide support. So we know that there was a very well-circulated article in the LA Times about one of our undergraduate students, Ismail Shamu, who was living with his siblings in a trailer in Hayward, largely as a result of his family's own insecurity, coming from an immigrant family from Mexico, but of his own family's insecurity while living in the Central Valley. Ismail, we understood, took care largely of his siblings as well as trying to advance himself through his undergraduate career here at UC Berkeley. Now, what can we kind of think about through the case of Ismail, right? So what we have is really an intersectional situation where we have matters of financial insecurity, right, as well as a somewhat racialized kind of sensibility of one's existence here at UC Berkeley, which we understand that is also a major issue that compounds, in fact, the pressures that students face, right? We understand that the history of the United States is one in which economic circumstances are highly racialized, right? We think about this as being a class problem, but we understand, as Stuart Hall said famously many, many years ago, that race is the modality in which class is experienced or class is lived. And so if we have a student like Ismail who is facing the the limitations, right, of a kind of immigration status, or at least a family who has these kinds of concerns. We have also the fact of him representing a minority member of our general undergraduate population here at UC Berkeley. On top of that, the financial pressures, the economic insecurity, right? We understand that this is therefore not a problem solely of economic circumstances, right? But of the very multitudinal impact that economic circumstances simply help to illuminate, right? And so therefore we have to then think about these very complex manners by which these sorts of pressures are experienced. And I think that's one of the first steps in understanding this. And this is something that gets remedied in many ways through the kind of multicultural efforts on campus, like the Multicultural Center, the establishment of the Fannie Lou Hamer Black Resource Center, right? So for students who I've worked with in my capacity as a professor in African American Studies, as well as a professor in geography, each of these departments representing in their own ways a minority majority population of undergraduate students. In AFAM, we clearly have a lot of African American students. In geography, a good amount of our undergraduate students who qualify as racial minorities are of Latinx background. And so between these two positions, as a professor of African American Studies, as a professor of geography, it therefore becomes very and almost regularly apparent what these pressures are for these students. And so one of the ways that I try to address that is through a course that I offer called Race, Space, and Inequality. It's a cross-listed course between these two departments. And so what I have our students do in trying to understand what is the lived practice of the qualities of a racialized world, a world that is unequal in many ways, but in which racial inequality is often mapped onto geography. I have these students do an end-of-year project, end-of-year presentation of what is a semester-long project, where they go out and they try to understand the way that these thematics are experienced in the world. And so I bring back a couple of their insights, right? And one is certainly around this question of housing insecurity. And what's fascinating is that the way that some of these students understood housing insecurity is in many ways the manner by which we, let's say as gainfully employed or largely gainfully employed adults understand this, right? Well, the cost of living compared from one area to another, right? So my students were able to map the cost of living as undergraduate students as we move towards the hills down towards downtown Berkeley, and what the quality as well as cost of housing means across that geography. One of the other things that they brought to my attention, which I largely neglected, was the disparity in the fraternal organizations or fraternity and sorority housing, right? And how there is within, I can't remember the actual national organizations, I think IPC, I can't remember what they are, but how there are various levels of support. Right? The university provides these fraternities with a certain amount of support. The alumni networks that come out of these fraternities provide these on-campus fraternities and sororities with a certain amount of support. And so therefore, if you are able to get into a fraternity or get into a sorority, that lends a sort of security, right? But what happens then when we begin to think about the kind of ethnic fraternities that exist, right? Or the non-normative fraternities that exist, which are outside of, say, Berkeley's formal support network, right? Which do not have the same kind of alumni structures that can give support. And so there's an interesting way in which the landscape of housing gets read as being much more complex than just simply what's available in the official dormitories, right? Or what's available in, say, just the open market, right? There's a kind of messaging that gets presented to students that we then have to begin thinking about. Furthermore, there's this, another matter of the transfer students. So a good portion of my students in my classes are transfer students. Even when I went to university, was a transfer student, right? And there's this concern in which the campus remains very freshman-centric, right? Again, there's a kind of normative manner by which the university not only defines, but supports its students. And there's a sense in which transfer students who, in many ways, have come to the university through transfer by way of, let's say, a non-traditional educational career path, and therefore are further outside of this access of support. And so I think there are myriad ways in by which we need to begin to define the population who we're concerned with, right? I began by saying, well, there are graduate students, and now there are, as I've kind of began to explain, various ways of beginning to identify undergraduate population. Now, I know that the university has made efforts, and I think Kyoko might speak more about this, in terms of establishing food pantries. You know that Styles Hall has been a very fantastic refuge for many of our students, meal sharing plans, campus gardens, and so forth, and access to emergency loans, for example. But nevertheless, there are still various challenges and blind spots. For example, last year, a colleague of mine, Chayuma Elliott, in African American Studies, really took up the mantle and helping to support the overflow students, right? So there are students who get housing at Mills College, or they received housing at Mills College. And according to policy at the time, they were not allowed to, in fact, use their meal plans to purchase food on campus, right, at UC Berkeley's campus. And so what you had was a kind of food insecurity by virtue of campus policy. Because they were residents at Mills College, they could only use the meal plan at Mills College's cafeterias, right? So what that meant is that they perhaps ate in the morning, but could not eat again until the evening, right? In addition to having the commute, right? And so I think, what I hope at least is that through today's discussion that we begin to think about some of the complex ways that our students begin to identify their position on campus, and maybe begin to think through some resolutions for accommodating those multiple dimensions. All right, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Amy had mentioned, my name is Kyoko Thomas, and I'm the new Basic Needs Manager. And I'm very grateful to be here today, in part due to all of the work that my team members have done up to this point in terms of really developing some very thorough basic needs interventions and services, which I'll talk about. One thing I want to really emphasize and just name explicitly, I think it's important to think about the systemic and structural influences that we basically have our students situated here when they're in UC Berkeley. And again, Jovan did such a great job in terms of introducing some of these broader structures and systems, and things that we really do want to consider is the rising income inequality, rising cost of living, and inadequate jobs that pay living wages. And so then you're thinking about, in terms of a food and housing context that's really important is, the Bay Area, as Jovan mentioned, is one of the most expensive places to live in the world, and Berkeley in particular as a city is one of the most expensive college towns. So all of that combined, then as a student, those factors are compounded. And so, I'll share a little bit of the data today, but what we know about any basic needs insecurity, whether it's food or housing insecurity, has long-term impacts on students' mental health as well as their academic performance. So a lot of impacts related to their GPA. And so really the efforts around the Basic Needs Committee is to really ensure that we're including student, staff, and faculty voice at all levels of decision-making related to the services that we're providing. So again, how is this really impacting students at UC Berkeley? So in 2015, UC Office of the President conducted a survey of all 10 universities in the UC system. So what that looked like was roughly 66,000 students who were surveyed related to basic needs security. And so where UC Berkeley lines up is that roughly 39% of undergraduate students are food insecure. And again, we wanted to ensure that information related to graduate students was also captured. And so 23% of graduate students report being food insecure. Now, when we're thinking about where does that definition come from, it really is pulled from the USDA food security model that really is looking at anxiety about where a next meal is coming from, a reduction overall of meals based on lack of resources, primarily financial resources. And then ultimately, that number is profound. I think it speaks volumes in terms of the reality that our students are faced with. And then also, we really want to think about how is UC Berkeley as a campus doing in terms of our students who are either housing insecure or homeless. ultimately, with the UC-wide study that was done, it was estimated that 5% of students across the system were housing insecure. But based on a study just from the Chancellor's office around UC Berkeley, it's estimated that 10% of the population is housing insecure. So I think it's important to actually think about translating data in terms of the actual number of students. So we're really talking about over 11,000 undergraduate students and around 2,500 of graduate students who are food insecure. And then again, for students who are homeless, that's over 3,000 students. So I think it's important in terms of understanding UC Berkeley with this data and why basic needs efforts have been so critical over the last few years. So one thing that has been really important is thinking about not just reactive services on the basic needs efforts, but also prevention. So in terms of our model, in terms of what services we're really trying to focus on, is intervening at the point at which any student is admitted to UC Berkeley, whether that's a freshman, transfer student, or graduate student. So what that looks like is really partnering with our financial aid officer, which I feel like it's been a great success where we have an identified member of the financial aid team who is dedicated towards working on basic needs issues. So when students are meeting with any financial aid counselor, they're able to identify basic needs services as a resource. And that's really also intended to ensure that as much as possible, we're normalizing basic needs and also destigmatizing some of the efforts. When we're thinking about, again, other preventative measures, we have large efforts in terms of signing eligible students up for CalFresh. So again, before a student even is hungry, we want to identify, based on income and other eligibility factors, if a student is able to, apply for CalFresh. And what that is on the federal level, it's called SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, but it's important in terms of the language we're using on campus, which is CalFresh. And so we have a partnership with Alameda County Social Services and the Food Bank to really identify and do targeted outreach for students who are eligible so that they could get this financial assistance for food every month. And then moving down towards more of the skill building, because that's really important to think about how does a student access nutritious food that's affordable, and how are they thinking about meal prep. And so we have a lecture that's offered through the nutrition science and toxicology department that's really around personal food security. So really teaching a course on how one meal preps in a way that is affordable and healthy. And the great thing is that the students get to take that food with them. And we always joke that I think a lot of us that aren't students could also benefit from that particular class. And then we have emergency relief services. So this is really critical. So at the point at which students are faced with a potential eviction or loss of housing, or are skipping meals due to lack of financial resources, we have the food bank, which is very visible and a great resource on campus that anyone could use. And we're actually shifting gears to be more inclusive, to actually start to have staff be able to access the food pantry as well. The other emergency relief service we have is our food assistance program, which, knowing that CalFresh has pretty strict eligibility requirements, there are a lot of students who cannot get CalFresh. And so our food assistance program allows students to have, financial resources basically added directly to their Cal One card so that they can get meals in the dining hall. And then kind of the most intensive intervention we have in terms of our basic needs model is me as the basic needs manager. And so my background is in mental health. And so my role next semester will really be focused on working directly with students, providing direct case management, especially for students who have a complex set of needs, who might be both food and housing insecure and maybe struggling with their mental health issues as well. And so I will be holding a caseload, really helping a certain set of students navigate these particular resources, both on and off campus. And so just to note as a side, I wanted to make sure that this is useful. So we have a handout at the back if any of you are curious, but that has the information for basic needs services. And one other thing that's very exciting, in the spring we're actually going to be opening a basic needs center in the lower level of the MLK Student Union. So the idea is that both partners on and off campus can be co-located in the basic needs center. So it's really a one-stop location for any student to come to, so they're not having to manage the stressors of being food and housing insecure and then having to navigate the university and services off campus, but they can come to us, meet with a social worker from Alameda County Social Services for CalFresh. We could direct them to the food bank, or they could meet with me for a consultation or case management. So that will be opening in spring, and so it's really exciting in terms of the work that we're doing. So thank you.
So I thought I would just give an example of how this economic pressure question interacts with pedagogy. And in the College of Environmental Design, we use a pedagogy from 18th century France. It's called the studio, perfectly reasonable. And in the studio, students have to produce plotted color drawings at about $1.50 a square foot to plot. They have to produce them multiple times during the semester to show their work as it evolves. They build physical models made of wood or plexiglass or metal, and they show those to people who could be potential employers, public sector agency heads, heads of design firms, people from the museum world. So it's a very high pressure presentation, and there's no discussion of capacity. It's just you have to show the work, and your work is compared to the person next to you with no discussion of what your relative capacity is. It's interesting that in CED, we have a lot of students who are, just to give you a little sense of demographics, 41% of our undergraduates, neither parent has a four-year college degree. 37% are Pell Grant recipients with something like a typical family income of $24,000 a year. 21% are underrepresented minority students, and 30% are transfer students. So these are the people choosing to do a major based on 18th century French educational methods. When we do an exit survey, we discovered in 2017 that a number of behaviors are common. Everything from scaling back on the quality or scope of presentations. This is all the stuff they have to make and print because they're concerned about cost. That's up to 44%. Do it often or very often. About 40% skipped meals to save money. So they're literally choosing whether to plot or eat lunch. They worry about their debt and their family's debt, and about 30% used a credit card to make ends meet. And you can see that one is bimodal. About 44% never used a credit card to make ends meet. So that's interesting. That's a big difference in strategy. And then the exit survey quotes. The students are aware that they couldn't afford things and that they are being criticized in their work quality because they couldn't spend more money. And the faculty member may not even know that there's a limitation, and that they sometimes where they wouldn't even pass. So we looked at the costs to get an estimate in 2017 of what they're actually spending, what they're pretty much required to spend by the way the pedagogy works. And this is the studio pedagogy is in architecture, landscape architecture, and environmental planning, and there are some studios in the city planning department as well. So up to $3,500 for a one-time purchase, including their laptop, and $3,700 per year in consumables. That's a lot. So I share this partly because I myself had the experience as an undergraduate of trying to take architecture and deciding that I couldn't afford it. I mean, I got a list of materials I had to buy and thought, you're kidding, right? And then gave the death of a grandparent excuse a couple times. Can't hear me? I had to make excuses a couple times about why I couldn't make presentations. And then I thought, I can't do this, and dropped the class. And ended up doing a master's degree in design, which was kind of funny, with a lot of debt, and then did a PhD in landscape architecture at Harvard, where the standard for financial aid was that they considered your parents' capacity, even though I was an adult. That's Harvard, you know. And they said my mother would have to give a $10,000 IRA. That was the only money she'd saved. And she was about to retire, so I didn't even ask her. And they basically said, we won't give you financial aid. So I was creative, and I used a credit card, and then eventually filed for bankruptcy. So at my first faculty job, it was kind of a funny situation. I had to be a roommate, couldn't have my name on a lease. I had just gone through bankruptcy. I'm teaching at the University of Washington, can't get a phone because I had just gone through bankruptcy. So a lot of these issues follow people through their careers, and it's still hard to talk about. But that's why I think it's so important, and why I've made it an issue in the CED, and why I said yes to the panel. Thanks.
We're not going to solve your problem now. So
My problem is solved.
for your students. For your students. So I'm Rachel Sandberg. I'm at the library. I run the Office of Scholarly Communication Services. And we've just completed a pilot that I'm going to tell you about today. There are handouts in the back, actually, with high-level summaries. But I want to kind of lay the groundwork for what it is that we have just done. So if you talk to students, they will tell you that they could have paid rent for the same price as one semester of textbooks, or that they can't enroll in as many classes as they want because they can't afford all of their books. And I will tell you, these quotes came from the University of Kansas. So imagine what folks are saying on this campus. And in fact, we just had included on this past year's UQ survey questions around affordability of course materials. So we should be getting that content back, and we'll have campus-focused information soon. The problem that they're talking about is the fact that in the past decade alone, just the prices of textbooks, which again doesn't cover her issue, but just the prices of textbooks alone have risen close to 90% in the past decade. Textbooks can be around $200 each. Most students are expected to spend around $1,200 a year in the cost of all course content. So in addition to textbooks, these are the print course readers or any other books that they're buying. Berkeley actually says that in their financial aid budgeting that they expect students to spend around $800. That's a fictitious number. It's not actually based on anything. And in fact, if they think that it's because, if they think students are only spending $800, it's because they were asked to buy more but only spent $800 because of what they could and couldn't afford. So again, the survey data that we're getting back will get a better picture of what students are actually spending. But on a national level, we know that 2/3 of students decide not to purchase required course content, course materials because of their cost. 1/3 of students take fewer classes because of the cost of course materials alone, and 14% drop the classes they enrolled in once they find out the cost of the course materials they're expected to purchase.
Is Berkeley data or the
This is national.
national data? Okay.
So last year, one of the kind of many hats that we wear in the library in being a major content provider to campus and actually spending literally $16 million a year licensing content for students was to think about how we can start addressing some of these problems. We created a pilot with the Center for Teaching and Learning and Educational Technology Services, which we had chartered by the Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education and the library, in which we offered 3 services, again, just on a pilot basis. And when I keep saying pilot, I mean we have no staff to actually do any of this. And so it was what we cobbled together in order to make recommendations essentially for how this could be scaled up. In just deciding to form this pilot and provide these 3 services, which I'll talk about in a minute, the Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education also decided to form a campus-wide course content affordability and accessibility committee. So bringing together both the affordability issues and also accessibility issues for disabled students, since there's a lot of overlap between the content that we make available and the format in which it's made available. And I represented the library on that committee, and we submitted our report to the VCUE's office in June. And it's now, our recommendations about scaling would subsume the kinds of services that I'm talking about here and make them scalable. So the first service that we offered related to electronic course packs. A lot of students are still being required to purchase print course packs. These can be anywhere from $35 to $150 or $200 to purchase at Copy Central the print version of materials that we license and give to students for free electronically through the library, or that are available online for free. And so in this version of the pilot, we worked with instructors to say, give us your syllabus. Let us find our electronically licensed version or the free version available online, not from pirate sites. And at least let us make those available to students who can't afford to purchase the print course pack. They can still, we're not trying to take anyone's print away. We know for a number of pedagogical reasons people prefer print, and I personally have to print everything out because I can't really understand it on the screen, but at least let's make an electronic copy available to students who can't afford to purchase the print copy. The second, if faculty want to actually upload the content to B courses rather than link to it, then we can help them understand fair use decisions, and they can decide whether they want to actually upload the material rather than just linking. The second service was to say, if you assign a bunch of books for purchase, let us see if we can license unlimited user electronic copies of those books so that all students in the class could access the book and read it at the same time. Let us at least see if we can obtain that license. It's free to students. We'll try to make those books available. And the third option was related to what are called open educational resources. These are learning materials. They could be textbook length or they could be modules that are freely available to anyone online to also reuse and adapt and modify in any way that they want. And we gave stipends to faculty who would either adopt, adapt, or create open educational resources or open textbooks. The big picture numbers of what we did, this is for last year, we supported 43 courses for approximately 2,400 enrolled students, and the estimated student savings was $240,000, a little over $240,000. I will say that it's estimated because we don't know whether every single person actually forewent purchase of print copies, but if they used the electronic materials in lieu of purchasing, then we saved those students $240,000. Just to give a little more breakdown of that, you can see by service type what portion of the how the classes broke down. So there were 8 open textbook classes, 18 ebook swap classes, and 17 course pack classes. Each student in an enrolled class who was participating in the course pack class would have saved an average of $95 per student. for the ebook swaps where we find electronic copies of the book, this number is actually wrong. It's supposed to be $76 per person, not $176, but so that was about $76 per student. And then for open textbooks, it would be $103 per student. Just to kind of ground this in what this actually means, almost 95% of the content we took from the syllabus to see whether we could give faculty an electronic copy, we already had. Meaning the library was already spending money on this content. The students were being asked if they had been required to purchase a print copy to pay for both the print and a copyright permissions fee for the same content the library is already licensing for them, available for free to them. With the electronic books, we were able, if we got a title list from the faculty, we were able to replace over half of them with unlimited user ebook licenses, meaning all of the students in the class could access them at the same time. And we would have replaced more, of course, but the publishers have a chokehold on the industry and don't want us to be able to license in this fashion. But still, to be able to offer more than 50% of those books for free to all students at the same time was quite something. So the next steps are that we've made recommendations to Central Campus about how this can be scaled up and what it would take. The library, you can imagine if we want to license more content to make it available to students, that money has to come from somewhere. The staff to administer scaling up each of these services needs to come from somewhere. And those aren't resources that the library currently has, but were part of the report that we made available to campus.
Thank you all very much. Can we give them
I have a question to the two faculty panelists and also to everyone in the audience is that I'm aware of the food and housing insecurity, and lots of our students, especially transfer older students, they have part-time jobs. And then the conflict happens is I constantly got emails saying that my shift has changed, I cannot come to the class, is my absence will be excused, it's kind of out of my hand, it's of course I understand they need to pay bills, but on the other hand, participation in class matters. And if they do not come to class or do assignments, how do I feel very conflict on this issue. How do I maintain kind of the fairness to everyone, so to speak? Yeah, thank you.
Is that in a large class context?
Well, 100.
Pretty big.
Okay.
I taught at the University of Virginia where it was not allowed for us to use attendance as part of the grade. So I'm already accustomed to the idea that students sometimes don't come, and that's going to be reflected in their grade. I put notes and PowerPoints online. I didn't have a fully recorded class, but because it wasn't possible to include that in the grade, I'd already gotten over that. The idea that they may not attend, and that it's on them to catch up. So I accept that now because I don't use attendance as part of my grade because I'm used to that, and I recognize that some people need that flexibility, and some just feel that they don't have to come and hear me talk about it. They did the readings. So I don't know what others would say, but I would consider embracing the idea that attendance shouldn't be part of the grade.
Yeah, I think for me as well, I don't have attendance as part. Sorry, thank you. I don't have attendance as part of my grading rubric, but I have participation, and so what that means is that that participation can be met in a variety of ways, in the classroom or through office hours. It's about just the engagement. I mean, when I was an undergraduate student, I worked at Whole Foods Market, and full time actually. And there were some times where I remember one semester I had to withdraw my entire semester's courses because my boss changed my schedule. and it was just impossible to, I commuted to school. It was a 30-mile commute each way, and so I had to just withdraw for an entire semester. And so I think I bring that into my kind of pedagogical strategy. The other thing that I do is that, and this may not be possible with a class of 100 students, but I have a class that's about 75 students. And what I do is I split the week where one day is just lecture and then the other day is discussion. So if it's a Monday, Wednesday course, then Mondays we do just a lecture, and that's largely me, going through what I have on the PowerPoint. And so if they miss that, then they can largely get what they need to get from the PowerPoint. And then the Wednesday is the opportunity where we kind of go over some of the ideas and so forth. And so what that means is that structurally there is kind of built-in mechanism, because I remember these are all adults, right? So I mean, as great as it might be for them to come, we can't force them, right? And there's no longer this demand in a way that we can. I taught high school, so I know that there was different ways in which you can mandate students to do certain things. But here we can't, right? But understanding that this is a real circumstance. I mean, the commute alone, and we have to think about commuting students here and Bay Area traffic, which we didn't even discuss, right? So for them, it's like, okay, if you make it to at least one day out of the 2 each week, then we know that you're getting something, and then hopefully you can build in other ways of, office hours are important. And so you might be, trying to more forcefully, require that they come to office hours and speak to you.
Great. Anything else, or can we go to another question? All right, we'll go back here and then up here.
Hi, my question is about housing needs. How is the university leveraging partnerships with the cities, mayors, to really address the housing needs? So they have land at the Richmond Field Station. Not sure about the accessibility of land space in Berkeley, seems to be a little limited. But how are they leveraging the relationships that they have with legislators and city officials to address the housing need? Because even though students have financial aid, it's still expensive. And so most of their financial aid is being spent on housing rather than for their basic needs in the first place.
I can answer some of that. And granted, I do want to preface that I am new in my role. So I think there's two things. One, I wanted to uplift Ruben Caneda, who is my colleague and truly my mentor, and who has done so much of the great work around basic needs. So his role, now that I'm in this position, is really working more on a larger level to address some of these issues. So for housing, for example, to think about, one, partnering with the other 9 UC campuses. He's a co-chair, and so thinking on a UC system-wide level what the interventions are related to housing, and also to address larger policy level issues. So I think there's more to come there. There is a local group that meets. It's the Catalyst Group for Homeless, I think it's called Homeless Youth. And so they're primarily focused, so it's a few different members of faculty from this campus, but they also partner with some nonprofits, and a member from the mayor's office attends, and so it's a monthly meeting. But we all come together to really strategize around partnership, as well as what the current resources are. So it's a helpful coalition really to start having these really higher level conversations. And so that's an important group that exists to really tackle housing, because I think for the interventions I even named related to basic needs, there's more food insecurity interventions, and so housing feels like this monstrosity, but there are systems in place and dedicated folks who are starting to have these conversations.
I just happen to know the chancellor told me that she's proposing, or will be proposing, People's Park to be redeveloped as housing, and that's UC Berkeley property. And so I bring it up as a case in my class, and I ask the undergraduates if they would protest the development of People's Park as housing, given that it would benefit them. And about half of them raise their hands and say they would. And then I feel like we've taught them the wrong thing. they're not getting the fact that this is a crisis and we need to build or consider transfers of development rights. So I think Berkeley has to develop its own land before it can have much leverage with other city officials.
That's one of the reasons, the half of them that are supporting. Sorry.
What are the reasons that the half of them give for not supporting?
I haven't
development
talked
of
to
this
all, it's a big class, 100 and something, so I haven't talked to all of them to know, but the ones who shared their reasons said open space is important, parks are important, that we shouldn't develop parks for housing.
Another narrative that I've heard related to People's Park is around the fact that it already houses communities of people, right? And so we're thinking about displacement. So that's, I think, one of the main reasons.
I was going to add that I think that the idea of developing People's Park is really not straightforward. Is that when we think about the internalities that Berkeley is kind of addressing itself of textbooks or course materials or design materials, actually the biggest effect on our broader community is the 7,500 new development spaces that we're about to create for undergraduates, and the fact that we have so many out-of-state and international students who are pressing up the rental market, so that when we kind of take that as a kind of a rubric of new political engagement and economic development of the university, what happens to the rest of our community? So our students are directly attached to those communities, even though so many of them are out of state and international, is that if you look at the racial and ethnic breakdown of Oakland and Berkeley, people aren't living here anymore who are coming from marginalized communities because we're pressing them out. So I think that, you know, you have to do holistic development work to think about what does it mean to support our undergraduates with their housing needs at the cost of the broader community.
Okay, your next
I wanted to give a shout out to Rachel because I teach 3 labor studies classes, and 2 of them benefited from Rachel's work of creating online course materials, and she was working through the entire winter break to make that available for the spring semester. And the classes that I teach attract that are 99%. People who are working 2-3 jobs, undocumented, transfer students, etc. And for them, it made a huge difference. So thank you very much, Rachel, for that. I wanted to ask Kyoko, sorry, I'm sorry. I think it's wonderful that the university offers all of these assistance on basic needs. I would like to point out, though, that in general, we should be asking the larger question is, why do we have these needs in the first place among our students? And the irony was made evident to me when I announced in class last semester that there was this session, because we were talking in class about different approaches to social change. And students identified immediately that this was service-based model of change versus advocacy or organizing, which is what we teach. And one of the students pointed out when we were talking about the session, which was canceled, is that just 2 days before that, the price of a meal went up by $2 each. Now, that to me is, ironic, because we're talking about mopping up basic needs when in fact the system is set up in such a way that it creates those needs in the first place. As we have heard also on the panel before, these are the things, materials for classes, coursework, books, etc. We should be making education more affordable, period, and for students of all different backgrounds. It's great to have these programs, but, we're going in the opposite direction as far as education is concerned.
Anybody want to respond? Oh, I know. Okay, thank you.
I had sort of a practical question. It sounds like with the books work that you had done, the materials, that it was a sort of limited pilot approach, largely because of staff, and sort of see, is there a vision for expanding that, and or the things that you may have learned that there is not library staff available? Are there things the most effective things that you can teach at a department level so that we can expand that.
Yeah, and so that's all kind of part of what our campus-wide course content affordability and accessibility report contained, but sort of if we think about this in a couple of, based on the service, here's what we can continue to do and here's what we can help you do. So for course packs, there is nothing stopping anyone at this moment right now from checking to see whether the library catalog has what they're looking for or whether there's a version available online. I'm here to be able to help you answer fair use questions. If you are, it's always your decision, but I can help you understand the landscape. And it's always fair. I mean, you don't have to worry about fair use at all if you link to something. It's only if you actually upload the content itself, because then you're making a copy of it from a copyright perspective. So anyone can do that now. Now, faculty are very busy, and that's not something they necessarily want to do, but the reality is it's in their control and power right now to be able to make those decisions. You can also make a decision that you're not requiring students to purchase the print, because if you require them to purchase the print, then it cuts off the ability for students to perform well who don't have money to purchase the print copies. On the electronic book side of things, even though we don't have staff the real staff investment comes with the course packs. You can send us a list of your the books you assign, and we can check to see if it's very easy for us to check to see if we can get an unlimited user license, and as long as we have funds to be able to do it, we'll get that. So that can continue even if we don't have central campus support for that. It's just a matter of your subject matter liaison librarian checking to see whether we can get that license. And then on the open textbook side of things, we continue to support that. I'm not giving out grants. That was sort of an incentive to help people, and I've recommended grants as part of efforts to scale up. But if we had 77 faculty members who wanted to create their own textbook, and there's a variety of platforms that they can use to do it. I continue to help them with it. Now, that's a long-term process. You can't, and so we won't see those textbooks for another year or two. But if that's something you're interested in and aren't necessarily attached to getting the grant to be able to do it, we have platforms and support that can help you.
Thank you for the presentation, and but taking it in the direction of the structural issues, right? I really appreciate that effort to take care of the students by relieving the immediate needs, whether it's housing or a textbook, right? But it is kind of a larger structural issues, and in some ways, I think we all understand that we are not going to win that fight on a larger, kind of on a whole playing field. As a graduate student in the history department, I kind of deal with those issues. I see it with my students, but also I was a former Berkeley undergrad, also a transfer student, and as an immigrant, right, I kind of lived that what you are describing. But my question is like, I'm glad that the institution started studying itself. You guys had the studies that show the homelessness, the cost of the textbooks, right? But the fact that the institution is trying to confront its own image, right, the reality, what is happening with those numbers, right? Because on one hand, it's fine if we are discussing it here because we all experience those, but how are the numbers used in order to help our upcoming students to potentially make an educated decision whether or not they even want to come to Berkeley? Because that may be a solution to the structural issues, because we are not going, it's kind of not our job to confront an issue that we don't have a solution for, right? Like, I am exhausted, and now on the top of everything else, I have to help my students get the materials necessary or help them with emergency funding. I have a student who brings his little brother to sections, right? Because there's no one to take care of his of this child, right? And I have this kid sitting on the back of my section, drawing, because like this is what I can do, but other GSIs may not feel comfortable with that, right? But maybe by influencing kind of our students who are kind of in certain ways consumers, right? Giving them realistic numbers of what your life at Berkeley may look like. Maybe that will force the institution to change kind of their approach, right? Why not? Right? There is this huge, advertisement of Berkeley as this leading institution of public education, and I absolutely love Berkeley, right? This is why I stayed here. On the other hand, it's a crisis and something has to change. And as Christina said, right, like what kind of different decision you would make or students would make if they knew that reality up front. Because being poor at Berkeley is humiliating. It already cost me my marriage, right, when I entered the program. And I am not sure I feel ready to be a part of like happy advertising package, right, for Berkeley. If I know what it's like, what it may be like for some people who are thinking about coming here, either as an undergrad or grad student.
Maybe we need a website
a lot of
written or supported by tenured faculty who have job protection, who can tell something about what life is like for students in different programs.
So, do folks want to take? There are a lot of different pieces of that.
There's been one
comment.
more question too that's been waiting to happen. I don't know.
Yeah, no, we'll do. But I wanted to see if any of you wanted to respond to any of those issues around. I guess sort of transparency is one of the sets of issues. Another set of issues that comes up for me in what you said is around access. So we don't want to just say, oh, it's expensive here, so people shouldn't come, right? So how do we handle all that balance, which is really complicated? And then the third piece I hear is the emotional side of what it's like to be living this, and how do any of you maybe work with that in your work, your program, your classes, your advising relationships? Anybody want to respond to any of that? And then we'll take your question.
One thing I wanted to say is that and it's funny because Victoria and I were talking about this before the program began, which is that we have to think about the lives that students face after they leave Berkeley, right? And so there's a rationale, there's a calculation of facing some of these challenges in the choice of coming to a place like Berkeley, because it's about having a better life chance afterwards, right? And so we know that in addition to there being, again, these issues of disparities within the university, we know that perhaps going somewhere else, going to one of the Cal State choices might be more affordable, right? You might be able to live closer to home, for example. But we know in terms of the long-term intergenerational impacts on student earning potential, right, that Berkeley is in many ways the better choice, right? And so I think there's something that we have to begin to think about as far as beyond the university, not only in a geographic kind of frame, but also temporally. What happens to these students afterwards? How can we think about the questions of the longevity of indebtedness from coming to a place like Berkeley? I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that in the United States, at least, our students have access to student loans, right? So there are these different things that we have to kind of keep in mind, especially if we think about the kind of immigrant circumstance of coming to a place like Berkeley and having even fewer resources, right? So as far as how I deal with these kinds of questions in terms of my advising, it's one of just like compassion and understanding, right? I mean, because we know that as individual faculty, we are carrying a tremendous amount of load, especially for GSIs in particular. Again, I called graduate students one of the backbones of our labor structure in this university. They do a tremendous amount of labor and are getting really pennies, for every dollar that they are earning for the university. I think it demands, interestingly, greater flexibility. The advising is something where, what can you do, really? In AFAM, we buy our graduate students Trader Joe's gift cards, and at the beginning of every semester, we hand out, something like thousands of dollars of gift cards. And this is a terrible response, right? It's fantastic, but it's terrible at the same time. I think... I'm talking, but I feel silenced in many ways by just the sheer weight of the matter at hand, and I'm not sure, how to overcome these structural matters where we're thinking about the broader political economy in which Berkeley sits itself, right? We have to then think about or rethink, or get the administration to rethink its priorities, right? Where money is in fact being spent. Because there is money and there's money being spent, but we know what the money is not being spent on, right? So that is inherently a political matter, right? And what we are understanding that these are economic circumstances that we're discussing, but it is rooted in a political matter. And it's a question of where we're giving our resources to. thankfully, you know, I'm glad to hear about these programs, Rachel, and I don't require my students to buy any books. My undergraduate courses are 100% article based. And that might be to some of my colleagues a pedagogical compromise. But I know that my students are in fact able to afford to learn, right? In my grad seminars, I only assign books that can be accessed through the library, right? Meaning the ebook service. That's it. And so for my students, they read a book a week in my grad seminars, and that's the strategy, and we learn what we can, right? So we know that in some way or another, something has to give, and if it might be just simply my pedagogical approach or philosophy, then that might have to be just simply the resource that I give up.
The other thing I'll add is that when you're talking about the money exists, it's not being spent in the right ways. Everything's complex. So another piece of that is the money exists and it is being spent in the right ways. Like the library has invested in all of, we license 95% of what's on the syllabus, but it's invisible if faculty don't allow linking to our content. And so in a lot of cases, the money is being spent appropriately, but the resources can be better leveraged.
Sure. And I say this as I'm hearing like the marching band outside.
Yeah, exactly.
Kyoko, I was curious if you wanted to take a stab at any of the mental health side of that.
Yeah, I think to me it's kind of the classic both and, right? We know that there are these structural issues that exist that we are operating within that really replicates inequity for our students. And so thinking about being able to address the students' needs while they're in crisis and still be able to advocate on a higher level, which is really important, because I think about coming from, a background where I worked primarily with adolescents in a crisis context or juvenile justice, and operating within systems where inequity is present at every turn. And so still providing direct care and services while still advocating and pushing back, using data to really leverage what we need, which are larger changes. And what's interesting is that we're talking about UC Berkeley, but in terms of the data, in terms of students who have food and housing insecurity within the Cal State system and the community college system are almost identical. And Ruben and I actually went to a conference in Philadelphia related to basic needs for college students across the nation, and this is a prominent issue. And for the first time ever, it's wonderful because we have more students of color going to four-year universities, more first-gen students. And what that means, though, are, I think, a little bit what Jovan spoke to earlier, is that there are compounding factors in terms of these systems that they find themselves in. And so there are efforts system-wide, so not just UC, but the CSU and community college system to really collaborate with one another to really see what the larger advocacy efforts are to address some of this, while still acknowledging that our students are suffering and wanting to actually provide some tangible support and resources for them.
Thanks. So let me just give you a quick overview of how we'll proceed from here to the end. We're going to take one more question for now, and then we'll take a few-minute break since it's getting to be time that y'all are probably hungry. We have some food, and then you can pick up food and come back in, and we'll continue the conversation either more informally, or if you want, we can continue it more formally. But we'll take one more question before we pick up lunch.
I just want to say I have to leave at 12:30 to give another presentation on open access, because this is also Open Access Week, so it fits in very well with that. But if anyone wants to get in touch, if you just Google the Office of Scholarly Communication Services from the handout on the back, you can find, okay, in 3 weeks it'll just be me, but right now there's two of us.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, one more question.
Well, thanks. So my name's Karen. I actually work at University Health Services in health promotion, and this is really stimulating. and I'm also a resident in Berkeley, and I have 2 college-age kids, so it's hitting on a bunch of levels. So one, I wanted to just follow up about housing and mapping and housing stock in our region. And I just attended a meeting at the school board where there's a group that's advocating to get the school board in Berkeley to use some of their extra property to build housing for educators. So your point about on the city level, like students are perceived as pushing families out of Berkeley. So some students are packed in there and paying ridiculous rents. So I think housing is so fun, and I'm so interested in working on this, and I just wonder, like, who you're connected to that we could do a better job mapping the housing stock and utilizing it better, like the Greek houses.
Right.
So that was one thing about housing stock. And that issue is complex too, because they're living in places where their landlords live in LA and they don't take care of the property. So it's even the quality, not just the price of the housing. And it's, multifaceted impact. And then this whole notion of kind of, I like your comment about it's both and, because it does start to feel like, are we doing too many Band-Aids to put a Band-Aids on parts of the problem without advocating? And there's a part of me, like, I teach a class and I do require attendance as part of the grade. And in part because, and I don't let them use technology in, because our emphasis is about like social health and being able to be in a place together and learn together. And I have very little readings. It's really all about what happens there and learning from each other and participation. So I had a moment where I thought, oh no, and then I know my college student like never read anything on her syllabus, but got great grades because she went to class and she felt like I learned by hearing, and what they say is what's really important and what they're going to test us on or expect us to, be paying attention to. So I just, this notion of like, making sure where the and is and where is the shared leadership for the and for our campus that also connects with our community and regions, so that we're not just advocating for small solutions when we, need to be aware of more. So thank you.
The band obviously thinks that was a great comment. And Christina, you look like you have something to share.
I was just going to say, I think that when I look at my faculty colleagues, I see a pervasive attitude that students are trying to get away with something. And my department doesn't actually allow leaves of absence for grad students based on financial circumstances. In that kind of philosophy of students are trying to get away with something. If it was mental health or physical health, they'll be okay. That's wrong. And I think that in general we need to re-examine that set of attitudes. I mean, your case of a class where students need to be there to discuss, and that's the main thing, totally. They have to be there. That has to be part of what's evaluated. That's the experience. But when we require attendance because we think students are getting away with something, whenever that thought comes up in faculty conversation, I think we have to nip that in the bud and replace it with compassion. Just knowing these statistics.
Can I just quickly respond? I think the city of Berkeley has a misrepresentation of its identity. It likes to continue to think that it's a nice, sleepy residential suburb, where it in fact is, a metropolitan area. And so what we know is this is a matter of density, right? I mean, with the failing of SB 827, a few months ago, we understand that there is this issue at hand. If there's any question, it's about that. It's about one of identity fundamentally, and that's very slippery, I think, for sure. But there was a person who left who made a comment earlier about the housing. I think she left early. But there must be some kind of broader discussion that the university officials have or should at least have with Berkeley politicians. Because what we know is that Oakland in many ways is carrying the weight of Berkeley, right? Earlier I mentioned that student who was living in Haywood, right? And so there are clearly responsibilities that the city of Berkeley has to the students, right? And I think there's a really perverse way of seeing the students as a burden, whereas that without them the city of Berkeley would be in much trouble.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.